Hello, Liquid New Hampshire. So, this is going to be another solo episode, and my voice is going to be a bit more nasally than usual because I am still sick. Um, I wanted to give you guys some resources for learning more about politics. One of the main goals of Liquid New Hampshire from the start was I have a couple of friends in my life who are relatively apolitical, who they feel pretty guilty about it. They're like, "Oh man, I want to learn more about politics. You're so into it, Dominic. You're so on. You got your thumb on the pulse, man. I want to learn more about it, but I don't know how. I don't know much about it. I'm gonna help you do that. So I'm gonna speak to them and to anybody else in the world, in the audience, or what have you, that's in that same sort of relatively apolitical place. And what I think you'll find, I think this is a big problem, especially nowadays, is when people try to bring somebody into politics and get them involved, they're also trying simultaneously to get them into their particular politics and their particular dogma. And that doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not a good strategy. Like, forget anything else about it. It's not good strategically. If you want people involved, you have to show them a diversity of perspectives and just get them informed in general. And maybe then, once they're kind of have a surface level of what everybody in politics believe, then you pitch them on your particular worldview. Then you try to bring them in to your particular group. I think you got to get them interested and involved beforehand. So I'm going to do today's podcasts. I'm going to give you some podcast suggestions. Everything that I've selected here is very specifically not like fun podcasts. I find them fun personally because I'm a nerd, but they're not like laughy, more entertaining type stuff. This is stuff that's more informative. It's more on the informative side. I don't really think I would ever do a laughy podcast suggestion video because it would all just be me laughing at Alex Jones. That's like it's the one laughy podcast I listen to is one where they make fun of Alex Jones. So I'm going to start with local podcasts because one of the goals is to get people in New Hampshire specifically to have more news sources and sources of information. And even after years of being involved in politics, I didn't really have any New Hampshire specific news or information sources. I had to kind of find them on my own. So I'm going to save you some time finding these, and I'm just going to tell them to you directly. So here are four New Hampshire specific podcasts that I found very helpful. Okay, the first one is $100 plus mileage. It's named after the amount that our legislators get paid. That they get paid $100 plus mileage, and the goal is to highlight bills that maybe don't get a lot of attention in the state house. So they do a sort of a state house watch for bills that are being passed in New Hampshire specifically. But they pay extra close attention to bills that maybe aren't super partisan, that might not get national attention, that sometimes there are debates, right? There are still two sides to the story, and they try to be bipartisan and to cover both sides on every single bill. But a lot of times the bills will be things like, should we allow coyote hunting or something like that? You know, it'll be an issue that's not super widely discussed. It's not super like the activist groups are all talking about it, but they still have weight. They still have an impact, and I think it's still good to be informed that our legislators are hearing these bills. So they're a great podcast. I hope to have them on as a guest at some point. The next one is the New England Take. I've already had AJ Kierstead of the New England Take on Liquid New Hampshire in the past. That's a great podcast. It's a conservative perspective on New Hampshire legislation, and I do think it's interesting, even if you're not a conservative, to hear what people in the same exact geographic area as you are saying about very specific bills being passed in your state house. I think it's good to know, like I wouldn't have even known that sort of a lot of like trans bills, for example. I wouldn't have even known that those were up for a vote if it wasn't for things like the New England Take. So even if you're not a conservative, it can be good to listen to these local resources, because sometimes just having that, your thumb on that pulse, they'll alert you to something that's going on, and maybe you can show out on the other side. Even you'll still know what's going on a little bit better. The next one is Civics 101 from NHPR. This is New Hampshire Public Radio. They actually put together a podcast series that is specific to New Hampshire for civics, which is, I think, kind of cool, because there's a national one that NPR does, but they do it specific to the New Hampshire government, and it can get very nitty-gritty. It's not your 10th grade civics class. They talk about the executive council. I would suggest that. I'm going to do episode suggestions for some of these. I suggest the executive council episode, and I also suggest the Citizen Legislature episode of that podcast. And then there's New Hampshire News Recap. So this was a really big find for me personally, because I am not a boomer, and I do not have the attention span to watch normal news. I cannot stand it. The ads. Oh my god, ads in 2024? What are we doing? What are we doing here, people? And the way that it loops back on itself, that you'll be watching and you'll be like, wait, they already covered that. You watch the news for an hour and you'll hear them, they're gonna warn you about the story, and then they're gonna do the story, and then they're gonna say, hey, did you catch that story we just did? Like it's like watching frickin' The Voice or something, where they have to have a trailer every 5 minutes for the next 5 minutes of the episode. Unbearable, unwatchable. I can't stand it. But New Hampshire News Recap is covering the same exact stories. It's giving you this week in the news of New Hampshire news, and it's giving you it in like 15 minutes, and it's giving you it without any advertisements, without repetition, without looping back on itself. It is just a pure, unadulterated dose of what is going on in New Hampshire. So if you're like me and you hate watching the news, but you want to keep up with New Hampshire news and you want to be informed, I suggest New Hampshire News Recap. It's very good for people who hate being informed but want to be informed. So that's it for the local podcast suggestions. Now I'm going to go into the maybe more ideological podcast suggestions. So right off the top, I'm going to say these are not any one ideology. I'm spanning the political spectrum here, and I'm placing an emphasis on viewpoints that are non-conventional, because that's who I like to listen to, that's who I like to pay attention to, and that's who I like to highlight the voices of on this channel. So the first one is Pitchfork Economics. Pitchfork Economics is a progressive economics podcast that looks to push back against more mainstream economic perspectives. The two episodes I would suggest are higher minimum wages are creating more jobs. That's where they argue that higher minimum wages actually create more employment rather than cause unemployment. And the next one is banning non-competes is good, actually. They're talking about non-compete clauses there, which are theoretically, they're something that companies use to protect insider information for their industry. But in practice, a lot of people, including Pitchfork Economics, would say that they prevent workers from being able to quit their jobs when they want to and take their skills and talents elsewhere, and as a result they consolidate the market and put downward pressure on wages, so they contribute significantly to ordinary people getting paid less money. The next podcast I would suggest is the Art of Manliness Podcast. Given the name, you would think this is kind of a manosphere type thing, and a lot of these manosphere types are very vitriolic. They're very, let me grab as much attention as possible. Andrew Tate, great example. Let me just say the most atrocious things I can, get the most attention garnered I can. They definitely do have, they're definitely a pro-masculinity couple of guys on this podcast. They're definitely of the belief that men and women are different, for example. But they are, I think, a lot more moderate, a lot more well-spoken and polite. and their podcast talks about a lot of different stuff. I think they're maybe first and foremost a maturity podcast, a life advice podcast. Just a second. Yeah, their emphasis is really more on how can we create men who are well-functioning, mature adults. And so they talk about everything. So let me give you the episode suggestions. The brain energy theory of mental illness. So this was a theory of mental illness that derives all mental illness from the same place, and it's from a sort of a deprivation of good energy to the brain. Not really sure how well evidenced this particular theory is. Not necessarily launching an endorsement of this particular theory, but I do think there's something to the idea that maybe a lot of our shared mental health woes can be rooted in sort of basic things like a sense of community, a lack of resources, eating good food, and exercising more. And that's basically the advice of this one, is eat good food and exercise more. And then the next one is get a handle on your shrinking attention span. This is the kind of stuff they do. They do sort of a self-helpy type of stuff. And I think it's valuable in politics to have a group of people who are talking about how the modern world makes us all very short attention span. I think that's a good thing. I think self-discipline can be a good thing, and I think they are the best resource I've found for self-discipline that didn't scare me away as like a lefty who tends to be a bit more critical of that stuff. The next one, massive change in tone from the last one, is called Maintenance Phase. Maintenance Phase is a fat acceptance podcast. So Maintenance Phase is they detail every sort of aspect of health and nutrition. They'll talk about everything from, diets to what foods are good for you, what foods are not, every diet trend that there is, even vaccines, health measures. They talk about literally everything from a perspective of trying to be very research-based and scientific, and also, they do have some ideology, which is that they're very critical of eating disorders. They're very critical of fat-shaming people, just like being mean to people for being fat, which I think we could all hopefully be against just being mean to people. I'd like to think that could be an agreeable, moderate position. So yeah, let me tell you a couple of the episodes. Body Mass Index, that is where they criticize the BMI as a form of measurement. I find any sort of debate or philosophy over the nature of measurement and the practice of measuring things very interesting. I think metrics deserve a lot of criticism. I think we live in a world that is overly reliant on formal numbers and reducing the world to numbers and not enough on common sense. And in a lot of ways, the fat acceptance movement is a kind of common sense movement relating to health and diets. The next one is The Trouble with Sugar. I don't fully remember that episode, but I assume it's about sugar. This next podcast, so this is a great one. This is called Open to Debate. They used to be called Intelligence Squared debates, so some platforms might still have them as Intelligence Squared. They're called Open to Debate now. All of these are going to be in the description, by the way. I don't remember if I said that. Every single one of these podcasts, I'm going to have a complete list in the description, so don't feel like you have to keep up with me saying them one at a time. There's going to be a full list for you. This podcast is great because I, for most of my life, have been somebody who defines himself as someone who hates debate, because every time I've seen debate play out online or on TV or on the news, it's always, a couple of heads in floating boxes just screaming at each other, and talking over and interrupting one another, and I just hated it. So for most of my life, I was of the opinion there was no way to do a debate that wasn't just complete attention-grabbing, vitriol, just unwatchable. It makes you anxious to watch, makes you kind of itchy. You're like, oh, come on, let him talk. I want to hear what he has to say. This podcast changed my mind about that completely. I'm now somebody who I think loves debates, as long as they're moderated by John Von Damme. That's the moderator for this pod. And also, as long as they're, I guess, Oxford style is the term that I've learned is the type of debate where people get a long time to speak, and you're not allowed to talk over one another, and you respond to one another in long sections, so you get to really hear what people have to say without just screeching over one another. So here's a couple of the best ones. Is parenting overrated? This is a debate about the role of genes on the influence of human behavior. But it's also about the role of the environment and how we subdivide that. Some people say, parents have a lot of influence. Other people say the environment has a lot of influence, but parents in particular, maybe not so much. Maybe it's more your peers, your teachers, the TV shows you watch. The next one is, has globalization undermined the American working class? I think globalization is an issue that needs a lot more conversation in the modern world, especially with, I think the positions are changing. Trump is a lot more anti-globalization, and in response, a lot of Democrats have been a lot more pro-globalization. There's an emerging socialist left that's a lot more anti-globalization. It's become a key issue, and this is a great foundational debate to understand where everybody's coming from on that issue. So the next podcast suggestion is another debate podcast. This is also Oxford style, and it's similarly formal and respectable. This is the Soho Forum debates. So where these guys differ are open to debate is really, they'll debate anything, and they have a lot of episodes all across the political spectrum. The Soho Forum debates, they're more specific. They're a libertarian group, and they focus on debates of interest to libertarians. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One is national divorce. They had a debate from a libertarian perspective between one person who sees maybe not a national divorce, but secession as a good thing, and another person who sees a unified market as good for free markets. So one guy is like, secession is good for liberty. The other guy is like, no, I think that we need strong free markets, and I think that a strong overarching federal government is the best way to do that. The next debate is it time to eliminate nuclear weapons? So it's a debate on denuclearization in a libertarian context. I have found every single debate they've hosted to be super informative. Check it out even if you're not a libertarian. Great stuff. The next podcast is the Neoliberal Podcast. So the word neoliberal, and they actually changed the name. I should clarify. It used to be called the Neoliberal Podcast. It's now called the New Liberal Podcast, and it's put together by the Center for New Liberalism. And the word neoliberal is a word that is almost exclusively used as an insult by critics of our current free market capitalist economy. It's used by socialists. And this is not that. This is not socialists hosting a podcast about neoliberalism. This is people who have decided to own the word neoliberal and use it as a self-identifying marker. So, what do neoliberals believe? It's very difficult to put your thumb down. I would say that they're fairly moderate. They're not very extreme politically on most issues. They're sort of very pragmatic in a lot of ways. Um, I think they would be against a lot of extreme views that come out of libertarianism. I think they would be against secession. I think they would be against anarcho-capitalism, or dissolving the state into the markets completely. But they're generally in favor of deregulation, lower taxes. They're generally pretty free market. They're pretty culturally left-wing. They're, very pro-LGBT, pro sex work decriminalization, a lot of stuff like that. They seem to care about some role for government in some areas. Like I saw them talk about investing in our ports, in having strong port system, because they believe very strongly in free trade and open borders. And I think they see the government as having a role in infrastructure spending and in encouraging globalization and trade. That's probably the biggest thing neoliberals agree on, is they're very pro-globalization. They see the world as very interconnected and very complicated, and they want to just kind of bring that interconnectedness together. They're pro-open borders, so that's kind of an extreme position compared to a lot of their more moderate views. So yeah, they are ideological, but they're a unique ideology, and I just think they're very interesting to learn about, because they're a group that doesn't get any real attention, but I think they're almost the dominant perspective in a lot of ways of what comes out of Washington, and yet almost no one is espousing that perspective. So here are the episodes. One is they do a 2-part series on Georgism. Georgism is a worldview rooted around land value taxation. Probably too complicated to tell you everything about Georgism right now, but check it out. That's another niche philosophy that doesn't get a lot of attention, that they give some attention to. And the next one is The Truth About Food Trucks, which is a great example of their worldview and practice, which is that our regulatory state was not really prepared for food trucks as a craze or to exist, right? And so they argue for a form of deregulation that probably the left can get behind too. It's deregulation in the sense that they want regulation for food trucks, but they don't want regulation to prevent food trucks from existing. So I feel like probably most people on the left, when they think about deregulation, they're not thinking about making it possible for food trucks to exist, right? Okay, next one is the Seriously Wrong Podcast. So these guys they're basically utopian anarchists, sort of, or utopian socialists. They don't view utopian as a negative word. They really want to envision the perfect ideal world, and they spend a lot of time advocating for utopianism. They're also very optimistic, and probably one of the funnier podcasts on this list. They do a lot of bits. They combat a lot of things like misanthropy. They don't like the idea that humanity just sucks. People are bad. People are so dumb and terrible. They're very against that idea. They're very optimistic, very bright, very focused on the future, and they advocate a form of socialism that is a lot more decentralized, a lot more libertarian, a lot closer to maybe an anarchism than a lot of maybe more Marxist-Leninist thinkers. So, let me see. The Imaginary Tragedy of the Hypothetical Commons. That's one of the episodes to check out. And that name, I think, says it all, because they're talking about the tragedy of the commons, and the reality of the history of the tragedy of the commons is that it's based on a hypothetical that never really existed. And in the real world, the commons have been being self-governed by indigenous people for millions of years. So they go over that history. It's very good. The next episode I suggest is Disability Justice. That's a very good episode. They explain in detail how socialists and leftists think about intersectionality, think about their relationship to other social movements like the disability movement. So it's not just about disability, it's also about how socialists see disability as being related to socialism. So it's an interesting one to watch or to think about if you're interested in strategy and debates on the left about identity politics or intersectionality. Um, Next one is the American Compass podcast. So this podcast is a group of conservatives. I think they call themselves like new right conservatives. It's headed by this guy Orrin Cass, and they might have some more significant influence in the near future because J.D. Vance is kind of associated with them, and he's a vice presidential running mate with Trump right now. So they might get a lot more attention in the near future. We'll see. They try to be very pro-worker. They're conservative, so the way that they're pro-worker is different from socialists. And I have heard some progressives and socialists and people on the left say that they're not really pro-worker. I think they are. I think they just have a different way of going about it. But they do try to bring a lot of attention to issues that are specific to uneducated working class Americans. And I specify uneducated because one of the first episodes that they do, I suggest the episode Ban the BA box, which is the bachelor's degree box on a lot of HR representatives, sort of on a lot of job applications, I guess. Their policy proposal is to require more companies to at least consider people who do not have formal educational credentials, because they argue that there's a form of discrimination that happens against people without formal educational credentials, that it's irrational, that it doesn't really benefit workers, it doesn't benefit companies, and they argue that we need to push back against that. In general, they're very in favor of the trades, very in favor of practical education, and very critical of higher education, and I'm with them on that for the most part. So I think their perspective is much needed. I think that particularly on the left, there's not a lot of attention paid, despite all the rhetoric about working class politics, to the fact that most real working class people are not college educated. The next episode I would suggest from them is Balancing U.S. Trade. This is another area where they have a unique perspective. They are specifically conservative, and they separate that out from libertarianism. Libertarianism has had a huge amount of influence on the right wing. I think if you talk to the average Republican, they would tell you in the same breath that they love free markets, and also that they're very, very opposed to immigration. And if you talk to a libertarian, that's maybe sounds like a contradiction. This podcast is kind of pushing back against libertarianism and its influence on the right. This podcast, they would say that they're not super big fans of completely free markets. They're critical of free trade, and I think that they are part of the ideological front behind people like Donald Trump, who are in practice functioning against free trade. But I don't think Donald Trump has much of a coherent ideological stance. These guys have a coherent conservative ideological criticism. They want to balance trade with China, and they want to bring back jobs that have been shipped overseas. And they want to do that by imposing tariffs and by limiting trade with countries like China. So that sets them apart from most Republicans, I would say. The next podcast is News Over Noise. So this is a great podcast because they're specifically focused on journalism. It's an all journalism podcast, and they're emphasizing forms of journalism that are, in the modern world, standing out and providing real expertise. So they're trying to do the same thing I'm trying to do, but as a project within the journalistic institutions. So the episodes I would suggest are Building Trust Through Solutions Journalism and Trolling the News in the Attention Economy. So solutions journalism is, I think, a great idea. It's a journalistic philosophy that says that most of the news focuses on problems and on chaotic events that are happening in the world. When you look at the news, what you see is a long list of things that happen to be happening. You don't see a long list of how to change things for the better. Solutions journalism emphasizes almost exclusively, here's what we can do. Here's what we can do about this problem. Here's what we can do about that problem. And then the next one, Trolling the News in the Attention Economy, is about how the news's openness and invitingness to a variety of perspectives and to the general public has led to a lot of people weaponizing that. A lot of people going on the news and very deliberately trolling news stations in order to get attention. Getting on the news in order to garner as much attention as possible, and how dangerous that is for the goal to just be grabbing attention rather than truly informing people. So the next one is the Laura Flanders Show. Laura Flanders is very, very focused on, for one thing, I think she has an emphasis on intersectionality. She seems to talk to a lot of black activists and indigenous activists and so on about their organizing and what they're doing. And I also think that Laura Flanders she's kind of doing solutions journalism. She's talking about what we can do almost all the time, right? So here are two episode suggestions, right? One is BIPOC media covered the elections differently. So this is an interesting episode because she's focusing on how independent black media, separate from the mainstream like CNN or MSNBC, talked about the election in different ways than the mainstream media. And I think this is especially important for like liberals to keep an eye on, because there's a problem and an assumption amongst liberals that they're fighting for social justice, and because of that, you can trust your media sources to be having the positions of minorities. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think that's always true. I think you're only really going to get that if you're actually seeking out organizations that are owned by, run by, operated by alternative grassroots people of color. So that was a great episode. Another one is the Participatory Budgeting Project. So participatory budgeting it's probably too much to get into on a list like this, but participatory budgeting is a popular program, popular democracy program, where ordinary people get involved in making decisions about specifically local government budgets more directly rather than politicians making those decisions. You open up some percentage of the budget to be grassroots decision making. And one thing I learned from the Laura Flanders show about this is that defund the police came out of a grassroots movement at a participatory budgeting event. Quote unquote defund the police as like a modern motto. I'm sure the motto existed before this, but this recent wave of it came out of a participatory budgeting proposal where they proposed less funding for the police and more funding for various community services. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting, and I don't know almost anybody who knows that, so I think the fact that she covered it says good things about her. Oh God, that's the sickness hitting me. All right. The next one is the Socialist Program with Brian Becker. So this is a very specifically socialist podcast. This is not a progressive podcast. This is not a Bernie Sanders populist left podcast. This is a revolutionary socialist podcast. And as a result, I think some of the economic issues that they've covered differently than I've heard anybody else cover them, and I think they did a great job with some of them. So here are the 2 episodes. One is the debt ceiling and the war on social programs. That's a great one on how the debt ceiling related to social spending. And the next one is 10 trillion for nuclear war, racing towards the nuclear cliff. Yeah, they talk about war a lot. They talk about anti-imperialism a lot. So I think that's a perspective that you might not get from liberals at the moment. The next podcast is the war on cars. I'm a very anti-car individual. I think as a young person, cars can be an enormous financial burden. I don't like driving them. They're scary. They're scary because if you mess up or don't pay attention for even a minute, you die. You die, or you hit an animal and you kill an animal. And I also think that they tear apart our communities. There's so much space dedicated to parking lots, dedicated to roads, dedicated to cars that could go to human beings walking around and sharing space with one another. And I think they've literally the ability to get to places that are farther away faster via a car has literally spaced us out from one another in the world in a way that has been very harmful and isolating for human beings. I think that we need a sense of community. We need to be around one another physically in the real world, and cars have prevented that. So I suggest 2 episodes. One is There Are No Accidents, which is an episode in which they argue that car accidents are a direct result of our car infrastructure, and you can't really separate our dependency on cars from people who die in car accidents. And the next one is the high cost of free parking. So the next podcast is Belabored by Dissent magazine. This is a good one. It's by a sort of a socialist, democratic socialist magazine, and they focus on the labor movement and on unions. So they're not really talking about socialism. They're talking about unions. It is a labor movement podcast first and foremost, and it's only ideological bias really is the labor movement good, right? So the 2 episodes I'd suggest are How to Bargain for Power and Retail Organizing at REI. That one was interesting because if I remember correctly, that was a sort of a very liberal, very woke social enterprise that had a union organized and bargain, and they did union busting. So it was very, very performative, virtue signally sort of a workplace, I think. The next podcast is Building Local Power. So this is another one with a political perspective that I think is very, very under-acknowledged, which is localism. This podcast is put out by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I strongly suggest checking out anything that they do. I'm a big fan of them personally. And this podcast advocates localism, and it advocates localism in a bipartisan way. They're just as open to conservative localists as they are to progressive localists, as long as they want to get our economy and our politics on a more local scale. It's welcome. So here are the 2 episodes. I suggest Anti-Merger Guidelines Would Stop Corporate Concentration, Revive Local Economies. That's the name of the episode. It's very long. but they're talking about mergers. They're talking about when two companies that are previously maybe smaller companies merge together and become a larger one. They're talking about changing the guidelines to make it more difficult for those mergers to take place when they're harmful. The next one is corporations rake in subsidies at communities' expense. That one's pretty self-explanatory. You know what that one's about, right? The next podcast is the Moneyless Society podcast. So this is another sort of a socialist one. This one is interesting, though. A lot of socialists don't talk a lot about the moneyless society aspect of their potential belief system. It's even, I would say, unclear to me whether or not most socialists even believe in a moneyless society. I would say more effort goes to advocating a planned economy, and then even more effort goes to advocating workers' cooperatives, and even more effort goes to advocating free public services like universal health care. Very little effort goes into the aspect of moneylessness that Marx talks about. So they talk about the possibility of a fully moneyless society. And they also talk about a lot of subjects adjacent to that I think are unique to them. I've never heard anybody else talk about this stuff. So one episode is Making Hierarchy Obsolete with Holacracy 1. This is an episode where they talk about holacracy, which is a sort of business management philosophy or trend that is about how to flatten hierarchy within organizations. I do not fully understand holacracy. I've bought a book on holacracy. I've tried to read it. Still don't fully understand it. But it's an interesting concept. The second one is Steps to a Resource-Based Economy with RBE United. Resource-based economy seems to be what the Moneyless Society podcast personally tends to lean towards as a proposal for what an economy without money would be. And it has to do with keeping track of all of our shared resources and providing resources to people directly without money as the mode of exchange. So listen to that episode for more details on that. The next podcast I would suggest is the Strong Towns podcast. The Strong Towns podcast is urbanism related. They're pretty open-minded, I would say, to talking to a lot of different groups of people. They're mostly behind what's called the YIMBY movement, which is a movement for affordable housing that calls specifically for a response to what they call NIMBYs. NIMBY is not in my backyard. The idea is basically that there's a group of people who will always argue that they do not want affordable housing in their neighborhood, driving down their property values, bringing crime, or what have you. And they're against that. They're in favor of more affordable housing. And they're in favor of a lot of other stuff, too. I think that if you think of strong towns as primarily YIMBYs, that might drive you away, because there are some people who are against YIMBY as a philosophy, and they might not give strong towns a fair shake, I feel like. Check them out either way. So the episodes I would suggest are on the conservative reaction to 15-minute cities. I personally love the concept of a 15-minute city. That sounds like the ideal solution to the car problem I was talking about earlier. So the fact that there's a group of people who seem to believe that it's an attempt to trap you in your city, like physically prevent you from leaving so that the world government could take over, I find that concerning as a backlash. And then the next one is Mike Hathorn. Where does decision making need to occur in our communities? This was a great episode because Strong Towns typically advocates preempting local zoning laws for housing in order for their YIMBYism, for more affordable housing to be allowed in. And this was an episode where they allowed somebody who maybe kind of disagrees with that to give their perspective. This was a localist of sorts, Mike Hathorne, who was arguing that while we should open up our zoning laws, maybe the best way to do that is not to have decision making from above enforcing that upon people. The next one is It's Not Just in Your Head. So this is another Marxist podcast, but this one is specifically focused on psychiatry. And they come at psychiatry from a very Marxist perspective, but a lot of the times what that means is that they are preoccupied with people's material conditions. They care about do you have a shelter? Do you have friends and family? Are you eating healthy? Are you exercising? Stuff like that. Do you have access to clean water where you live? And they use that as a basis for mental health. And so they critique the psychiatry industry medicalizing problems that might be a result of capitalism with pills. They have some interesting episodes. So one is how cultures create emotions. That's an interesting one. They're basically arguing that emotions are a kind of a social construct, that emotions differ from one to another. Like we all have emotions, but the distinction between like anger and frustration maybe might be different in different cultures. And there's this thing about how Germans have different words for different unique niche emotions, or how the Greeks had different words for different kinds of love. We use the word love for familial and sexual and like romantic and platonic love. It's all one word. This is a similar thing, and it also argues that our understanding of our emotions shapes how what we feel too. When we put our emotions in a certain box, that shapes what we feel. So I thought that was mind-blowingly interesting perspective. And the next one is Opioids Are Legitimate Medicine. I wanted to highlight this episode in particular because I said before that their perspective is typically critical of medication, all the time for as like the end-all be-all solution for mental health. They tend to be critical of psychiatry as an industry. On this episode, they went in the other direction and talked to an advocate for people with chronic pain, and they talked to somebody who was basically advocating that no, opiates can be good actually for a portion of the population that is in constant chronic pain, and it's real medicine for them, and attempts to restrict their access to that medicine can be harmful. So I thought that was a subversive perspective for them to allow on, and that made me want to point it out. I only have one more podcast suggestion. This is the last one, and this is the Compact Podcast. Compact they're the closest things probably to exist to a Nazbol, if you've ever heard of that, or a social nationalist. In other words, they're like culturally right-wing, economically left-wing. You could kind of say that they're like a MAGA communist. I think that a lot of people would say any of those words, social nationalist, MAGA communist, that's completely a contradiction. There's no relationship between those things. They're opposite things. They come from opposite theoretical places. They have no points of unity. I think if you listen to Compact Podcast, you'll realize that there are some through lines, actually, between culturally right-wing politics. And when I say culturally right-wing, I'm talking about they tend to be Catholics, a lot of them. So they tend to be traditional marriage, so probably critical of gay marriage, critical of abortion, critical of casual sex on a regular basis. I think probably critical of immigration. A lot of those sorts of issues. They're definitely very critical of trans people. That's probably a key issue for them at the moment culturally. Um, those are all issues for them. But then they're also economically left, and by that I mean they support things like raising the minimum wage, single payer health care. So they're maybe even to the left of your average member of the Democratic Party. They're maybe even progressive on economic issues. But they also might be even to the right of your average Republican on certain social issues. And the way that they talk about them, the way that they talk about the relationship between these issues, I really do see a lot of through lines between left-wing economic values and right-wing cultural values. I don't think it's as contradictory as people want to think it is, and I also just think it's a unique perspective on the issues, which is, again, what I'm trying to highlight here. So, again, you don't have to remember any of these. There's going to be a complete list of them in the description. I strongly suggest you check them out and learn as much as possible.